December 9th, 1977. A basketball arena full of noise, full of motion, full of the ordinary chaos of a regular season game between the Los Angeles Lakers and the Houston Rockets. And then, in the space of a single heartbeat, all of that noise passed away. One punch, one short, brutal swing of a right hand, and the man who threw it would spend the rest of his life trying to outrun that second. The blow landed so hard that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was right there on the floor, later compared the sound of it to a melon being dropped onto concrete. Think about that. A grown man, a champion, a giant of the game, reaching for a comparison that ugly to describe what he heard. That is how violent that moment was.
That is how unforgettable. Now here is what you need to understand before we go one step further. The man who threw that punch was not some thug who stumbled into the league. He was not a man with no future and nothing to lose. He was an all-star caliber forward, a brutal rebounder, a college scholar with a degree and a 3.37 grade point average, a two-time academic All-American who taught classes in social science. He was a thoughtful, disciplined man who had clawed his way up from being completely overlooked. And yet, after December 9th, almost none of that mattered. The education, the comebacks, the quiet decency, the years of grinding work, all of it got swallowed whole by 1 second on a basketball court. The world looked at Kermit Washington and decided it knew exactly who he was. This is the story of how a single act can erase an entire life. We are going to walk through all of it. The underdog who couldn't even crack his own high school lineup. The comeback nobody saw coming. The punch itself and the disputed seconds that led to it. The media trial that convicted him in living rooms across America. And the decades of exile that followed a man who was never quite allowed to be anything else. But to understand how one man became the face of NBA violence, you have to go back to a teenager who couldn't even crack his own high school lineup. Kermit Allen Washington was born on September 17, 1951 in Washington, D.C. And if you were looking for the early signs of a future professional athlete, you would have looked right past him. Because here is the truth that almost nobody tells when they talk about Kermit Washington. As a high school senior, he averaged just 4 points per game. 4. Not 14, not 24. 4 points a night in his final year of high school basketball. That is not the stat line of a prospect. That is the stat line of a kid who barely gets off the bench, a player scouts never circle, a name that never makes a recruiting list. There were no college coaches camped outside his door. There were no scholarship offers raining down. There was no buzz, no hype. No sense that this young man from the nation's capital was destined for anything at all on a basketball court. He was, in the most literal sense, overlooked. And you have to sit with that for a moment, because it tells you something about the man he would become. This was not a gifted phenom who had everything handed to him. This was a kid who started at the very bottom of the ladder, doubted, invisible, carrying around the quiet weight of being told in 100 silent ways that he simply wasn't good enough. That kind of beginning shapes a person. It builds something underneath the surface, a chip, a hunger, a refusal to accept the label other people had already stuck on him. Who was Kermit Washington before the world decided who he was? He was a young man nobody wanted, learning early that if anything was going to happen for him, he would have to build it with his own hands. And yet, within a few short years, this overlooked teenager would do something only 7 players in the history of college basketball had ever done. How does a 4 points per game high school senior become one of the most dominant players in college basketball? Nobody handed him the answer. He had to find it himself. And he found it at American University. What happened there was nothing short of a transformation. By the time Kermit Washington finished his college career, he had done something almost no one in the history of the sport had ever managed. He became one of only 7 players in NCAA history to average 20 points and 20 rebounds over the entire course of a career. 20 and 20 for a whole career. That is not a hot streak. That is not one magical season. That is sustained, relentless, year after year dominance. Let that contrast settle in. The kid who couldn't score 4 points a night in high school was now putting up 20 points and ripping down 20 rebounds night after night against college competition. The invisible teenager had become a statistical monster, one of the rarest big game producers the college sport had ever seen. And notice where the real engine of his game lived: the rebounding. 20 boards a night is a number built on hunger, on positioning, on a willingness to throw your body into the most physical, least glamorous part of basketball. That trait, that rugged, relentless work on the glass, became his identity. It was who he was as a player. Years later, that same physical, hard-nosed reputation would be twisted and used against him. But it started here, at American University, as a thing of beauty, a man who simply refused to be outworked.
But what almost nobody talked about was happening off the court, in the classroom, where Washington was quietly building a second identity that would later make the violent enforcer label feel impossible. Here is where the story of Kermit Washington stops being a simple basketball story and becomes something far more complicated. Because while he was dominating the glass, while he was building that rugged reputation between the lines, he was doing something most people never knew about. He was excelling in the classroom. Kermit Washington graduated with a degree in sociology and a 3.37 grade point average.
He was named a 2-time academic All-American, a distinction reserved for athletes who perform at a high level, not just in their sport, but in their studies. And it went further than that. In his senior year, this man was actually teaching. He led courses in the social sciences, standing in front of students as an instructor, breaking down the ways people and societies work. Sit with that picture for a second. The same hands that hauled down 20 rebounds a game were turning the pages of textbooks. The same body that bullied opponents under the basket belonged to a young man who could stand at the front of a classroom and teach. This was a thoughtful, educated, deliberate person, a scholar in a power forward's frame. And this is the cruel contradiction at the very heart of everything that follows. Because the man who built this second identity, the careful student, the academic All-American, the teacher, was about to be remembered by millions of people for one thing and one thing only: raw, shocking violence. The world would eventually paint him as a brute, an enforcer, a symbol of everything ugly in the game. And almost nobody would stop to remember that behind the muscle stood a man with a sociology degree and a teaching record. That gap between who he actually was and who the world decided he was is the spine of this entire investigation. Hold on to it. Everything that comes next bends around it. On draft night 1973, that scholar's name was called 5th overall, and the city of Los Angeles thought it had found its next great forward. In the 1973 NBA draft, the Los Angeles Lakers used the 5th overall pick on Kermit Washington. 5th overall. That is not a flyer. That is not a late-round gamble on a project. That is a franchise placing real faith in a player, expecting him to become a cornerstone. And of all the places a young man could land, this was about as bright a spotlight as the league had to offer. The Lakers were a marquee organization, a glamour franchise, the kind of team where the lights burn hotter and the expectations climb higher. To be a top 5 pick in Los Angeles meant you were not going to develop quietly. You were going to grow up in public, with everyone watching. Think about the journey it took just to get to that podium. The boy who averaged 4 points a night in high school. The kid nobody recruited. The overlooked teenager who clawed his way into one of the rarest statistical clubs in college basketball history, and did it while earning a sociology degree and teaching classes on the side. All of that work, all of that grinding had carried him to the 5th pick of the NBA draft and a contract with one of the most storied teams in the sport. For a moment, the story looked like it was supposed to look. The underdog had made it. The doubts had been answered. The city of Los Angeles believed it had found its next great forward, a powerful young rebounder ready to anchor the franchise for years to come. But the gap between the promise of a draft pick and the reality of a rookie season can be a brutal thing. And for Kermit Washington, that gap was about to open up fast. Because just 45 games into his NBA dream, something cracked in his back, and Kermit Washington made a decision that would quietly haunt the rest of his career. 45 games. That is all the rookie season Kermit Washington got. In a sport where a full year is 82 games, that number tells you something went wrong almost from the start. And what went wrong was his back.
Somewhere in the grind of that first year in Los Angeles, Washington hurt his back. It was the kind of injury that could have, and probably should have, sent him straight to the trainer's table, straight to the doctors, straight into an honest conversation about what his body could and could not do. But that is not what happened, because Kermit Washington made a decision. He kept it quiet. He said nothing. He swallowed the pain and he played through it, because he was terrified of one word: soft. In the world of professional basketball, especially for a young man trying to prove he belonged, there may be no more dangerous label than that. Soft means you can't be trusted. Soft means you won't last. Soft means the men around you stop believing in you. And for a top 5 pick already feeling the weight of expectation, the fear of being branded that way was stronger than the pain in his back. So think about the trap he was caught in. Here was a man who had spent his whole life being doubted, the kid nobody recruited, the player nobody wanted. Now he was finally in the league, finally on a marquee team, and the moment his body betrayed him, his first instinct was to hide it, to protect the only thing he had left, which was his reputation as a tough, reliable competitor. That is the brutal arithmetic of the macho code in pro sports. You are taught that admitting weakness is worse than the injury itself. So you bury it. You play hurt. You let pride make a decision that your body will pay for later. And pay he would. That hidden back injury did not simply heal and disappear. By his own account, it would bother him for the rest of his career. A silent thread running underneath everything that came after. Every season, every comeback, every brutal night on the glass. All of it carried this quiet, unspoken weight that almost nobody knew about. This is who Kermit Washington was at the very beginning of his professional life. A man already in pain, already hiding it, already paying a price for the fear of looking weak. And it set a pattern, because the world was about to keep underestimating him over and over again. By his 4th season, the only thing keeping him in the NBA wasn't his talent. It was a piece of paper. By the time Kermit Washington entered his 4th season in the league, the bright promise of that 5th overall pick had nearly burned out completely. The man who was supposed to anchor a franchise was now hanging on by a thread, and he knew it. Here is how far things had fallen. Washington himself understood that the only thing keeping him on an NBA roster was his guaranteed contract. Not his production, not his potential, not the faith of the organization. A piece of paper, a financial obligation the team could not easily walk away from. Strip away that contract, and there is a real question whether he would have had a job at all.
Sit with how crushing that must have been for a man who had clawed his way up from nothing. He had answered every doubt before. The 4 points a night high schooler became a 20-20 college force. The kid nobody recruited became a top 5 draft pick. He had spent his entire life proving people wrong. And now, in the league he had fought so hard to reach, he had been quietly reduced to a roster mistake, a contract the team was stuck with, waiting to expire. And it gets worse, because the Lakers had essentially written him off.
By reported accounts, the organization attributed his struggles not to the hidden back injury, not to the difficult adjustment, but to something far more damning. They reportedly chalked it up to mental deficiencies. Think about what that means. Here was one of the most thoughtful, educated men in the entire league, an academic All-American, a man who had taught college courses in the social sciences, and the team that drafted him was reportedly explaining away his failures by questioning whether he had the mind for the game. That is the cruel irony stacking up again. The scholar being labeled as someone who simply couldn't figure it out. The disciplined student being treated like a lost cause. Whatever the team believed, the message Washington received was unmistakable. They had given up on him. This was the lowest point. A player viewed by his own franchise as a mistake, surviving on a technicality, carrying a silent injury and a public reputation that was sinking by the day. Most men would have quietly faded out of the league right here, collected the last of that guaranteed money, and disappeared into the long list of high picks who never panned out. But that is not what happened, because one man looked at Kermit Washington and decided to test him, with a challenge so brutal it was designed to make him quit. The man who changed everything was Pete Newell, and the way he reached Kermit Washington was not gentle.
It was a trap, dressed up as an opportunity, and it was built specifically to expose whether this fading player had any fight left in him. Newell scheduled the practices for early in the morning. We are talking about the kind of hour when most people are still asleep, the kind of hour no one looks forward to. And the thinking behind it was almost cynical. By the account that has followed this story for years, Newell did not actually expect Washington to show up. The early morning schedule was a deliberate test. The logic was simple and a little brutal. A professional athlete, a man who already had his guaranteed money, would never drag himself out of bed at that hour to grind through punishing workouts. Why would he? He had nothing left to prove, and a contract that paid him either way. Newell, in essence, was betting on Washington to quit before he ever started. But Kermit Washington showed up. He showed up, and he did it without complaint. He did not grumble. He did not make excuses. He did not treat it like a burden beneath a top 5 draft pick. He simply arrived, ready to work, at the hour designed to break him. And that single decision flipped the entire arc of his career. Because once Newell saw that this man was serious, that the dedication was real, he put Washington through intense, demanding training sessions. This was not light maintenance work. This was a remedial rebuilding of a player, an all-out effort to take the rugged talent that had always been there and forge it into something that could survive and thrive in the NBA. This is the redemption arc beginning, and it is built on the simplest and hardest thing in the world: discipline. Showing up, doing the work when no one expects you to, when no one is watching, when every excuse is sitting right there for the taking. The kid who had been doubted his whole life answered the doubt the only way he ever knew how: by outworking it. You can almost feel the story turning here. The man the Lakers had written off was quietly rebuilding himself in the dark hours of the morning, alongside a coach who had bet against him and lost that bet in the best possible way. The transformation was real. It was working. The discipline was paying off. The transformation was working until a late-season game in Denver when Washington looked down and saw his own kneecap hanging off the side of his leg. It happened late in the season in a game against Denver. All that early morning work, all that rebuilding, all that quiet faith Pete Newell had finally placed in him. And then his body gave out in the most horrifying way imaginable. Kermit Washington tore his patella tendon. And the way he later described that moment is something you do not forget once you hear it. "I could feel it tearing inside," he said. "I looked down and my kneecap was hanging on the side of my leg." Picture that. A grown man in the middle of an NBA game, looking down at his own leg and seeing his kneecap displaced, hanging off to the side where no kneecap is ever supposed to be. The injury was that severe. This was not a sprain, not a tweak, not the kind of thing you tape up and play through the way he had tried to play through his back years earlier. This was catastrophic. This was the kind of injury that ends careers and changes lives. And that is exactly what the doctors told him. They encased his entire leg in a cast, the whole leg, and they delivered the verdict that every athlete dreads most. They told Kermit Washington that his basketball career was most likely over, done, finished. The work had been for nothing. The early mornings, the grinding sessions, the climb back from being written off, all of it seemingly erased by one terrible tear. And here is where the cruelty of the timing really lands. This was a man who had finally turned a corner. He had answered Newell's test. He had earned back a sliver of belief. He was, at long last, on the verge of becoming the player everyone once hoped he could be. And it was at that exact moment, just as the work was about to pay off, that his body collapsed under him. Think about everything this man had already survived. The 4 points a night invisibility, the hidden back injury he buried out of fear, a franchise that reportedly questioned his very mind. He had clawed back from all of it. And now he was lying there with his leg in a full cast, being told the dream was finished. For most men, that prognosis would have been the end of the story. A sad footnote, a cautionary tale about a top pick whose body finally betrayed him for good. But the man they'd written off twice was about to deliver the best basketball of his life. And the timing could not have been more haunting. The doctors had said it was over. The leg was in a full cast. The prognosis was as final as medicine gets. And then Kermit Washington did the only thing he had ever known how to do when the world counted him out. He came back. And he did not come back as a shadow of himself, limping through games just to hang on. He came back better than he had ever been. Through the first 25 games of his return season, Washington put up career highs across the board, 11.6 points per game and 10.8 rebounds per game. Read those numbers again, because they tell you everything. This was a man who had been written off as a draft mistake, then told his career was finished, and he answered both verdicts with the best basketball of his life. He was producing. He was rebounding at a double-digit clip. He was, finally, the player Los Angeles had gambled on years earlier. That double-double pace was no accident. It was the harvest of every cold morning with Pete Newell, every grinding session, every refusal to quit when quitting would have been easy. The discipline had won. The body had healed enough to let the work show. For the first time in his professional life, the story was bending towards something that looked like vindication. And then came the headline. That same preseason, the magazine Sports Illustrated ran a feature on Kermit Washington. The title on that layout read, "Nobody but nobody is gonna hurt my teammates." And to drive the point home, they posed him shirtless, fists up, set in a boxing stance. The image was meant to celebrate him, the rebuilt body, the fierce loyalty, the protector who would stand up for the men beside him. It was a tribute to toughness, to the kind of teammate every player wants in the foxhole. Sit with how that was supposed to read at the time. A protector, a guardian, a man whose physical strength existed to shield the people he played alongside. Those words were chosen as praise. No one reading that headline could have imagined that within weeks, those exact words would become the cruelest caption in sports history. A regular season night, the Los Angeles Lakers and the Houston Rockets. Nothing about the early going suggested that this game would carve itself into the memory of the entire sport. It was basketball, ordinary and physical, the kind of contest that fills a winter schedule and gets forgotten by the next week. And then, near midcourt, it started. A scuffle, bodies coming together, tempers flaring, the sudden ugly turn that any veteran of the game has seen 100 times. This was not one man against another in some clean, isolated confrontation. This was several players tangled up together, the way these things always happen. Fast, confused, a knot of arms and shoulders and shoving in the middle of the floor. Here is what matters about that knot of bodies, and it matters enormously for everything that comes next. A scuffle like this is chaos. It is not choreographed. From the outside, from the stands, even from the broadcast position, you cannot always tell who is doing what to whom. Players are reacting on instinct. Loyalties kick in. Men rush toward the pile, not always knowing exactly what they are rushing into. In that kind of moment, the truth gets blurry in real time, before anyone has had a single second to think. And this is the context the cameras would fail to capture. The full picture of that midcourt tangle, who grabbed whom, who threw what, how it escalated from a shove into something dangerous, would never be cleanly preserved. What survived was a fragment, a piece of the story, ripped out of the chaos that surrounded it. But in the moment, none of that was clear yet. There was just a fight breaking out at midcourt, several men involved, the noise of the arena rising, and a situation spinning out of control faster than anyone on that floor could fully process. And right here, the versions split apart, because to this day, no one fully agrees on who threw the first punch. This is the part of the story that has never been settled, not in 1977, not in the decades since, because the most basic question of all, who started the violence, has two completely different answers depending on who is telling it. On one side stands Kermit Washington, several of his Lakers teammates, and Rockets forward Robert Reed. Their account points to Houston's Kevin Cunnert. By their telling, it was Cunnert who threw a punch at Washington, Cunnert who escalated the tangle from a shove into something that drew blood and fury. In their version, Washington was reacting, defending himself in the middle of a fight he did not start. On the other side stands Cunnert himself, who told a different story. By his account, it was Washington who swung first, Washington who turned the scuffle violent. So which is it? Here is the honest answer, and it is the one this story has to sit with. The public accounts genuinely differ. We are not talking about a settled fact with one stray objection. We are talking about a real, documented contradiction. Credible men on both sides, each insisting on a different sequence of events, each carrying his own memory of those few violent seconds. And that contradiction is not a flaw in the story, it is the heart of it. Because this is the fog of a fast, brutal moment. When bodies are tangled and adrenaline is surging, memory does not record events like a camera. Loyalty bends what people see. Fear sharpens some details and erases others. Two men in the same pile can walk away with two sincere, opposite truths. Add the natural instinct of teammates to defend their own, and you have a moment that can never be perfectly reconstructed. What we can say for certain is that something inside that scuffle turned violent enough to set the rest in motion. But the spark, the first swing, remains genuinely disputed to this day. While those two tangled,
A third man was sprinting toward them, with the best of intentions, and Kermit Washington never saw who it really was. Out of the corner of his eye, in the middle of all that chaos, Kermit Washington saw movement. Someone was running toward the altercation.
A figure closing fast on the tangle of bodies at midcourt. And here is the misread that sits at the very center of this tragedy. Washington did not know who it was. He did not know why the man was coming. He did not know that this figure was racing in to break up the fight, to pull the bodies apart, to be the peacemaker. In the heat of that violent second, all Washington registered was a man charging toward him in the middle of a brawl. So he turned and he threw a short right-hand punch. The man running toward him was Rudy Tomjanovich, and Tomjanovich was not coming to fight. He was coming to stop one. The blow landed flush, and the impact was devastating beyond anything a basketball court was built to hold.
Tomjanovich's face fractured under the force of it. He went down instantly, unconscious before he hit the floor, left lying in a pool of his own blood at midcourt. One short punch, one catastrophic, irreversible second. Think about the cruelty packed into that single motion. A man known around the league as a peacemaker, sprinting in with the best of intentions, mistaken in a flash for an attacker. A protector, the very word Sports Illustrated had stamped across Washington just weeks earlier, colliding with another man's good intentions in the worst possible way. There was no plan here, no premeditated assault.
There was a violent scuffle, a charging figure, a snap reaction, and a punch thrown at someone Washington genuinely did not recognize as a friend rather than a threat. But intention does not undo damage. Whatever Washington believed in that fraction of a second, Rudy Tomjanovich was now motionless on the hardwood, his face shattered, blood spreading beneath him, while the arena tried to understand what it had just witnessed. Then came the sound, and the silence that followed it was described by those in the arena as the loudest silence they had ever heard. To understand why this moment cut so deep, you have to understand the man on the floor. Rudy Tomjanovich was not an enforcer. He was not a guy who went looking for trouble.
Around the league, he carried a reputation as a peacemaker, the kind of player who broke up fights rather than started them. And that is the bitter knot at the center of all this. The one man rushing in to calm the storm was the one man left broken by it. The sound of the punch carried. Reporters sitting up in the second-floor press box heard it from where they sat, the crack of it rising above the noise of the arena and reaching all the way up into the rafters. And then came the part nobody who was there ever forgot: the silence. Players described the moment right after Tomjanovich collapsed as the loudest silence they had ever heard. A whole building of people suddenly speechless, staring at a man who was not moving. What had happened inside that fracture was worse than anyone on the floor could have known. The blow had shattered Tomjanovich's face at a point measured at roughly 1/3 of an inch from his skull. 1/3 of an inch. That is the margin that separated a catastrophic injury from something unthinkable. Spinal fluid was leaking into places it was never meant to go, and Tomjanovich could taste it in his mouth. Sit with that detail for a second, because it is one of the most chilling in this entire story. A man tasting his own spinal fluid, not understanding what had happened to him. And he genuinely did not understand. In the haze of that moment, Tomjanovich believed the scoreboard had fallen on him.
That is how violent the impact felt from the inside.
His mind reached for the only explanation that could make sense of that kind of force, that something massive had dropped out of the ceiling and crushed him. He had no idea a single punch had done it. This was the instant the story stopped being about basketball. A peacemaker on the floor, spinal fluid leaking toward his brain, a building gone silent, and a man standing over it all who had no idea yet just how close the person at his feet had come to never getting up. In the hospital, a surgeon would compare what he saw to taping together a shattered eggshell and admit how close Tomjanovich came to never waking up.
When the doctors got Rudy Tomjanovich into surgery, what they found was not a sports injury in any ordinary sense. It was a fight for his life. And the man who worked on him said as much, in words that have followed this story ever since. "I have seen many people with far less serious injuries not make it." That was the surgeon's verdict. Read it slowly. People with less serious injuries than this had passed away. That is how grave Tomjanovich's condition was. He was not a player nursing a broken nose. He was a man who had landed on the wrong side of survival statistics, pulled back only by the work happening on that operating table. And the way the surgeon described that work tells you everything about how delicate it was. He likened the surgery to scotch taping together a badly shattered eggshell. Picture trying to reassemble an eggshell that has been crushed. The fragments, the impossibility of it, the way the slightest wrong move sends the whole thing apart. That was Tomjanovich's face and skull, held together piece by fragile piece, by a doctor who knew how thin the line was between saving him and losing him. The human cost did not end in that operating room. Tomjanovich was sidelined for 5 months. 5 months stolen out of a man's career and his life. Months of recovery, of healing, of putting a face and a body back together after a single second on a basketball court nearly ended everything. This is the point that the conversation around Kermit Washington too often skipped past, both then and now. This was not a hard foul. It was not a hockey-style dust-up that ends with 2 men in the penalty box and a story to tell later. This was a near-fatal injury. A man who came within a fraction of an inch in a skilled surgeon's hands of never waking up. Whatever you believe about how the fight started, whatever you believe about intent, the reality on that table was undeniable, and it was grave. But while Tomjanovich fought to recover in that hospital bed, something else was happening out in the world. Something that would shape Kermit Washington's life almost as powerfully as the punch itself. A single video replay was about to convict him in the eyes of the entire country. Here is where the tragedy doubles. Because there was a fight that night, a scuffle, a tangle of bodies, a disputed first swing, all the chaos we have already walked through. But that is not what America saw. What America saw was a fragment. The only available replay showed just one thing: the punch. Washington's short right hand landing flush on Tomjanovich, and Tomjanovich crumpling to the floor. It did not show the scuffle that came before it. It did not show the bodies tangled in midcourt, the shoving, the disputed spark, the figure charging in. It showed none of the context that might have made a viewer pause and ask what had actually happened. It showed a man throwing a devastating punch at someone who appeared, on that clip, to be doing nothing at all. Think about what that does to a story. Strip away the 10 seconds before the blow, and you do not have a fight anymore. You have an ambush. You have one man brutally attacking another for no reason a viewer can see. The missing footage did not just leave out detail. It rewrote the entire meaning of the event for everyone watching at home. And then the engine of mass media took that fragment and ran with it. Saturday Night Live, a show watched at the time by somewhere between 30 and 35 million people, replayed the punch over and over again, using it as a gag, a laugh line. Let that contradiction sink in. While Tomjanovich was in a hospital bed with spinal fluid leaking and a surgeon comparing his skull to a shattered eggshell, that same blow was being looped on national television for comedy in front of tens of millions of Americans week after week. That is how a man becomes a symbol without ever getting a hearing. Not through a trial, not through a careful examination of what really happened in that scuffle, but through a clip. An incomplete clip, missing the very context that made it human, burned into the national memory by repetition. Most of those millions of viewers never knew there had been a fight at all. They only knew the punch.
the footage had told half the story.
And half a story, repeated enough times, becomes the only story most people ever believe. Soon, it wasn't just late-night comedy. It was the evening news, with one of the most trusted men in America putting Kermit Washington on trial. When the story jumped from comedy to the serious press, it stopped being something Kermit Washington could ever hope to outrun. Because now it was not just a punchline, it was a national conversation, carried by the most credible voices in American media. The New York Times weighed in with an editorial on the incident. When the nation's paper of record devotes editorial space to a single moment on a basketball floor, that moment has stopped being sports news. It has become a question about the country itself, about violence, about decency, about where the lines are. The punch was no longer an event inside a game. It was a subject worthy of the most serious page in American journalism. And then came the voice that in that era carried as much trust as any in the country: Walter Cronkite. The incident was investigated on CBS News, brought before the audience by the anchor millions of Americans regarded as the most trusted man in the nation. When Cronkite put something in front of the camera, people did not question whether it mattered. They accepted that it did. And now he was putting Kermit Washington in front of them.
Consider what that meant for a man already convicted in the court of late-night television. The comedy had made him infamous. The serious press made him a national symbol, the face of violence in professional sports, held up before the entire country as an example of how ugly the games had become. An athlete, a college scholar, a two-time academic All-American, transformed in a matter of weeks into a stand-in for everything people feared was wrong with the sport. But here is the part that should give anyone pause. This enormous machinery of judgment, the editorials, the network investigations, the verdict reached in living rooms from coast to coast, was built largely on that same incomplete picture, the fragment.
The replay that showed the punch, and not the fight before it. The most respected institutions in American media amplified the story, without the full context ever reaching most of the people forming opinions about it. The credibility was real. The information underneath it was missing a crucial piece. And so a man was tried and convicted on a national stage, by voices no one doubted, working from a record that left out the very seconds that might have complicated everyone's certainty. And once the country had reached its verdict, the NBA delivered its punishment, a number that at the time was the harshest of its kind. When the league finally handed down its discipline, the numbers landed with the weight of a verdict. A fine of $10,000, a suspension of 60 days. By the time the calendar ran out, that suspension had cost Kermit Washington 26 games. For 1977, those figures were not routine. They were, at the time, among the most severe penalties of their kind the sport had ever produced. Sit with what that meant in that era. This was not a league known for dropping heavy hammers on its players. Fines were often modest, suspension short. So when the punishment came down at this scale, it was sending a message far bigger than the dollar figure or the game count suggested. It was telling the country that the NBA understood the gravity of what had happened, that it would not be seen as soft on the violence that had just played out in front of a horrified public. Washington became the example, the line in the sand. And here is what you have to understand about that moment. The suspension and the fine were real, and they were heavy. But they were also the surface, the visible, official part of the price. A man can serve a suspension. He can pay a fine, even a large one. There is a beginning and an end to a penalty written on paper, a date when the games resume, a balance that gets settled. What was happening underneath that official punishment had no end date at all. Because the league could only take 26 games and $10,000, the league could not give back his reputation. It could not undo the replay looping on national television. It could not reach into the minds of millions of Americans and restore the context that had been stripped away. The formal penalty was the one thing in this whole story that had clear limits. Everything else did not. So while the public saw a fine and a suspension and assumed justice had been measured out, the real damage was operating on a different level entirely. The official consequences were closing. The unofficial ones were just opening.
Because the real punishment wasn't financial. It was that the Lakers no longer wanted him. And a man with a sociology degree was about to become basketball's most unwanted player. The team that had once spent a top 5 pick on him, that had once seen him as a cornerstone, now moved him along. Washington was traded away. And that trade was the start of a journey that would carry him across the league, like a name no franchise could quite hold on to. Look at the map of where he went. He had come into the league with the Los Angeles Lakers in 1973. After everything broke open, his path ran through the Boston Celtics, the San Diego Clippers, the Portland Trail Blazers, and the Golden State Warriors. A career that stretched from 1973 through 1982, with a brief return in 1987. 5 franchises, city after city. On paper, that is the resume of a well-traveled veteran power forward. But underneath the transactions sat something heavier than any normal career arc. Because no matter which jersey he pulled on, the punch came with him. It rode along in every introduction, every newspaper write-up, every whispered conversation in a new locker room. He could change cities, change teammates, change coaches, change the color of his uniform, but he could not change the one association that had been welded to his name. He was, everywhere he went, the man who threw it. Think about the psychological weight of carrying that from town to town. Most players who get traded leave their troubles behind, or at least get a fresh page in a new market. Washington never got the fresh page. The single most defining fact about him traveled faster than he did. He would arrive somewhere new, and it would already be there waiting for him. The reputation, the clip, the verdict that had been reached on national television. He was condemned in one city and branded in the next, over and over, with no chance to ever simply be a basketball player again. And remember who was carrying that load. Not a careless man, a thoughtful one, an educated one, a 2-time academic All-American who had once taught college courses, now reduced in the public mind to a single violent frame. The contradiction that had haunted his whole career only deepened. The more he tried to keep playing, keep producing, keep being a professional, the more it became clear that none of it could outrun the thing that defined him. No matter where he went or how well he played, that 1 second traveled with him, and it raised a question the whole league avoided. Was the punishment ever going to end? So let us lay the 2 versions of Kermit Washington side by side, because the gap between them is the whole point. Here is the record. A high school senior who averaged 4 points a game and was wanted by no one. A young man who, against every expectation, became one of only 7 players in the history of the NCAA to average 20 points and 20 rebounds over an entire college career. A scholar who earned a sociology degree, carried a 3.37 grade point average, was named a 2-time academic All-American, and stood at the front of a classroom teaching social science. A professional who buried a serious injury rather than be called soft, who was written off by his own franchise, who tore his patella tendon so badly he could see his kneecap displaced, who was told his career was finished, and who came back to post the best numbers of his life, better than 11 points and better than 10 rebounds a night through the first stretch of his return. That is a documented life, a real one, full of struggle and reinvention and quiet dignity. And almost none of it survived in the public memory. Because here is the other version, the only one most people ever held. One word, one frame.
the punch. The man who hurt Rudy Tomjanovich. Everything else, the entire human being beneath it, got swallowed whole. The scholar disappeared. The underdog disappeared. The teammate that a magazine had once celebrated as a protector disappeared. What remained was a flat, one-dimensional symbol, an enforcer, a brute, the face the country had agreed to pin its fears on. That is what this story has been circling from the very start. Not whether the punch was terrible, it was. Not whether Tomjanovich's injury was grave, it nearly cost him his life. The question underneath all of it is how a complex, thoughtful, twice-doubted man gets reduced to a single second. How an entire identity, built over decades through work most people never see, can be erased by one fraction of a moment that millions saw out of context. A man is more than his worst instant. We all know that to be true about ourselves, about the people we love. And yet here was a case where the country decided otherwise and never reopened the verdict. And that leaves the hardest question of all, one that forces us to look at how we judge people for the worst second of their lives. December 9th, 1977 did not fade. It hardened into history. To this day, it sits among the darkest moments the sport has ever produced, the reference point everyone reaches for when the conversation turns to violence in professional basketball. Decades later, it is still there, still cited, still studied. The grip never loosened. And nowhere is the cruelty of that grip clearer than in the contrast between the two men at the center of it. Rudy Tomjanovich recovered. He came back from a surgeon comparing his shattered skull to a taped-together eggshell, from 5 months on the sideline, from a margin of survival measured in a fraction of an inch. And in the years that followed, his name traveled toward something else entirely, toward respect, toward achievement, toward a life and a career that grew far larger than that night on the floor. He was allowed to become more than what happened to him. Kermit Washington never got that release. His name stayed locked to a single frame of film. The scholar, the underdog, the comeback, the career across 5 franchises, all of it pressed flat beneath one image that the country refused to let go of. One man rose past the moment. The other was held inside it, permanently, by a public that had seen only the punch and never the man. That is the danger this whole story has been pointing toward. Not the danger of one violent second, though that was real, and the cost of it nearly fatal. The danger of memory itself. The way a society can take a single instant, strip it of everything that surrounded it, loop it until it becomes the only truth, and then decide that a man is nothing more than that instant for the rest of his days. So here is where we leave it. The facts are on the table. A documented life of work and study and reinvention. And one terrible second that erased it all in the public eye. The question is not the league's to answer anymore, and it never really was. It belongs to you. Should a man be defined forever by the worst second of his life, or by everything that came before it and everything that came after?